Sometimes working as an antique dealer or as a collector for any length of time, there's one thing that you learn, and that's patience. And I was fortunate enough to learn it pretty early on, some dealers and collectors can't wait, and I always felt that if you step on somebody's toes or you push them too hard, you're not doing yourself any favors, and you may in the end ultimately not get what it is you're interested in, and be polite and do your thing. And many years ago, in the 1980s, I got to know a very nice dealer, and I got to know him more and more over the years because his shop was pretty close to where my shop was. But I met him in the 80s. His name was William Friend, and he had a store on John Wise Avenue in Essex, Mass. Called Friendship Antiques. And one day he called me in the 80s. He was working on an estate with some rugs and carpets, and I knew quite a bit about him. And he said, "Could you give me a hand?" And I said, "Doing what?" And he goes, "Identifying some of them. I'm not sure what the exact names are. We're selling this estate." And I said, "Yeah, sure." So I went over there with him. I spent the morning and a little over a morning with him, going over the rugs and carpets. It was fun. And after that, I would go in and out of his store, and he always had interesting things. He was the quintessential North Shore Yankee antique shop. He was like something out of Central Casting. He had very fine American furniture. He had very fine European furniture. He had some tribal art. He always had good silver, some Native American things, Chinese export porcelain, very good paintings. He basically got in his store whatever was being taken out of old North Shore estates. And if you don't know the North Shore of Boston, the areas of Hamilton, Wenham, Ipswich, Essex, Manchester, Beverly Farms, those little towns, if you're not familiar with them, they were at a time one of the wealthiest communities, and they still are actually, one of the wealthiest communities in America today. And they were filled with what they called the old Boston Brahmins, started going there and having summer estates. Henry Frick actually came there and built an estate once, and they were such snobs they actually drove the poor guy out of town. He went back to New York and built the Frick Library. But it's an interesting place. Beverly Farms, just as an aside, is how they picked the name for Beverly Hills. When they were developing Beverly Hills in California, they wanted the snobbiest name they could think of, and the word Beverly came to mind because of Beverly Farms, Massachusetts. And it was a bastion of old centuries of Boston wealth. And these are people who live quietly with their huge fortunes from the trade, China trade, banking, railroad construction, all that kind of thing. And they built some big summer houses there, and all through the North Shore, built polo fields, eventually giant oceanfront summer mansions like you see in Newport. The Newport, Rhode Island really got its start because the people with a lot of money from New York and so forth weren't welcome on the North Shore of Boston, so they went to Rhode Island instead. That's the way it was. And Bill Friend and us in our shop, we would get calls to some of these great old estates around the North Shore when they were breaking up one of these 20, 30, 40 room houses, filled with things from the Grand Tour, European art, Asian art. A lot of them went to Asia on trips and bought boatloads of things, and it was not unusual. And this was where Bill fished, as they say. This is where Bill got his stuff. It's where he did his appraisals. And I used to go in and out of his store all the time, and there was in his office, he always had great things tucked away that he was enjoying, and they weren't always for sale. They weren't for sale. You asked once, if they weren't for sale, that was it. You left it alone. If you harassed him, he'd never sell it to you, and that's the way a lot of dealers were. You respect their privacy. And this is a story of a wonderful bowl that Bill sold me, that came from one of these houses, and we'll get into whose house it was because it's a pretty fascinating story. But here we go. So as I said before, this is the bowl, And it had sat in my friend's antique shop for years in a box in the back. And he had gotten it out of it. All I knew was he had gotten it out of an estate on Gilla Road in Ipswich, Mass. And it came from a good collection. And he wouldn't tell me much about it. All I ever saw really was the front of the bowl. And there was another bowl beside it in the box, a piece of white dingware with a copper rim, a really, really fine example. It had a hairline in the rim. But other than that, it was a really great example. And I asked if he wanted to sell it. And he said, no, I'm just going to hang on to it for a while. And I said, okay, well, if you ever change your mind, let me know. And this went on for 10 years. And every time I went in there, I'd see that in the back through the window in his little office, that box was still sitting there. And the edge of the bowl was sticking out of it, and he still had it. And every once in a while, I'd bring it up with him. I said, you ever decide what you're going to do with those two porcelains? And he said, no, not yet. And then one day, out of the blue, I was in there, and he just said, hey, you still interested in those two pieces? And I said, sure. And he said, well, you can have them. And I said, what do you want for them? He says, about $1,000 for both. And I said, okay, fair enough. And I bought it. I had no idea who made this bowl. I didn't know if it was Chinese. I didn't know if it was Korean. I didn't know if it was Japanese, Southeast Asian. I had no idea where this thing was from. And then when I finally got to really look at it, I was able to flip the thing over. And on the back were these labels. And one of them is a series of numbers, an inventory number, and below it says Warner Fogg. And Warner refers to Professor Warner, Langdon Warner, and Fogg means the Fogg Art Museum, where he was the curator. And below it is an exhibition number, 237. And I looked and looked and looked. I couldn't figure out where the thing was from. It had obvious Korean influences. It had obvious Chinese influences, the way it was potted. But I couldn't make head to tails of it because of the foot rim. And some other elements just didn't add up to one strong alignment. One fairly knowledgeable dealer said, I think it's some sort of oddball Sung Dynasty thing. And I didn't think it was, but that was his thought on it. And everybody had a thought on it. I had it in my office for a while. And I just loved the thing. I sold the dingware right away to a dealer from London for a very good profit, and I hung on to this. And finally, I just called the Fogg Art Museum and said, hey, listen, I've got this piece, and it's got this information on it, and can you help me out with it? And they said, sure. I gave them the information, and they got back to me after a day or so and said, okay, here's the information on it. It was loaned by Professor Warner to Harvard, to the Fogg Museum for a show here. I think they said in the 1920s. And then it was lent out again to an exhibition in Kansas City as part of a show on Asian ceramics and the traditions of Asian ceramics, which made sense because this bowl was done by Kawai Kanjiro. And Langdon Warner bought it from him directly at his studio while he was in Japan, which makes total sense. And Kanjiro was one of the great potters of the 20th century. He was a friend of Hamada's. He never sought fame and fortune the way some of them did, but he was considered by the inner circles of potters in Japan to be the best. And there's actually a little museum to his name. And he helped found the Japanese Folk Art Museum in 1926. And this was all around the time that Langdon Warner was there, had bought this from him. I don't know if he bought anything else from him, but I know he got this from him. And brought it back to the United States. And here it is. And it ended up in William Friend's antique shop in Essex, Mass. And now it's been in my possession now for over 20 years. And it took 15 years to buy it, I guess. That's when I first saw it to the time I got it. And Bill had gotten it from, I guess, Caleb Warner, his son, before he died. And there it is. I think Bill said this stuff was sitting in the box in the Warner's garage or in their barn, a bunch of things that had belonged to the professor. And that's the story of it. And it's one of my favorite things. It's about 100 years old at this point, and very atypical for Kawai Kanjiro. This is not something he typically did. If you look up his work, you'll see it's decidedly different. And this was something he worked on because he did do a lot of experimenting and a lot of fooling around and trying different things that might work. And this is just one of them. It clearly has a lot of influences from both China and Korea in how the glaze is done. It has many layers of glaze, and you can see how thickly it's pooled in the bottom. And then there's a significant amount of pooling up around the foot rim. So that's it. That's the story of this, and take a look at a few more pictures of it. So you have a very interesting bowl that was made by a very wonderful potter with a great reputation and much loved and all that in Japan, and then it was bought by a very colorful guy. And I don't know if you know anything about Langdon Warner, but he was not a man without controversy during his life. He was involved with heavily involved with the preservation of Chinese antiquities, Japanese antiquities. There were some big accusations made about him looting caves, and he is thought by many to be one of the prototypes, the models for Steven Spielberg's character in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He was that kind of a guy. That was the era. They went out and they went into other countries and they took things. And Langdon Warner wanted to actually build an American school of archaeology in China, but the war and politics, I think, got in the way and prevented that. But he was a very colorful character, and he was heavily involved in the preservation of antiquarian websites, historic sites in Japan during World War II. He was one of the monuments men, if you're familiar with that. And he was writing letters to Roosevelt telling them, tell the bombers, don't bomb this temple, don't bomb this area, don't bomb this, don't bomb that, because he wanted to preserve these historic architectural landmarks, monasteries, this kind of thing. And he ended up getting a monument built for him. It was erected in his memory in Japan, thanking him for his assistance in preserving their national treasures. And this was his story, and he was the first head curator of the Asian Art Department at the Fogg Museum. He was involved with educating and teaching. He was a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He was involved with installing many curators at art museums and educating them around the country. He was involved with the British. He was just one of these guys. He was, some consider him to be the most influential Asian art historian of the first half of the 20th century. And you can look him up. You can look up Langdon Warner. You'll find a great deal written about him. And this was one of his bowls, and it fairly thrills me to own it. And here's a few pictures of it. The color of the glaze is just wonderful. I can see why he bought it and why he wanted it. The color, the shape, the style, it has a lot of aspects to it that are the way the bowl is shaped, sort of like sungwares. It has multiple layers of glaze on it, green glazes where you can see where they dipped it and re-dipped it to get the color just right. And here you have the glaze that pooled in the bottom of the bowl and created this little bluish green lake. And the foot is neatly trimmed and has this very dense clay that Kanji used, and it's an interesting. It's just an entirely interesting package, and I'm just thrilled to death to own it. And that's how it came to be here. So again, it's one of these things with a story of ownership, who made it, where it came from, its backstory really enhances to me the value of owning anything. Owning things. Some things I own, I don't know anything about them other than I just bought them because they were great. But I also have things like this that have a great backstory on how they came into my possession. And I'm very, very pleased. And that's it. So thanks for watching. I hope you found it a bit interesting. And we'll be back later this week with the regular video. And thanks again. And have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.